welcome to Legislative Report. I'm State Representative Kurt Mosser. As you know, we've been doing these legislative reports and we've been featuring local businesses around the 107th District that are unique or bring something different to the table in our district. Right now I'm so happy to be at Old Forge Brewery and with Damien Malfara, who's the owner and also a brewer here. But Old Forge Brewery has proven to be a great success story. And we're going to talk to Damien and learn a little bit about the beer business. And Damien, thank you so much, first of all, for being a part of this. Tell us how you got into the...
Welcome.
Thank you. Tell us how you got into the beer business.
Well, I started out as a home brewer. I was the type of person that anytime I would travel or go around the state, I always would seek out craft beers. This was 10, 15 years ago. And they were hard to come by back then. There's a lot more of them right now. But I was living in Bloomsburg with my wife, and we felt that there was a need in the area. Having to drive so far to get a good craft beer, we thought, somebody should open one. Never thought it would be us. But as time went on, I kept home brewing in my garage, driving my wife crazy with all the smells and taking over the garage with all the brewing equipment. After probably a year of this, we eventually said, if nobody's going to do it, we should do it. So we actually got serious about it, wrote a business plan, and we actually set a deadline for ourselves that if we didn't open it by the end of 2008, we would give up on the dream and just live our lives. But as luck would have it, we opened in December of 2008 in Danville.
Had a great success story there. You started with a brew pub and grew that brew pub, and then did you come here or did you open the new location before you came here?
So we opened in 2008 at our original location, which was a small little space on Mill Street. And then we had the opportunity to open our production brewery in 2012. That was always my dream, was to open a production craft brewery and package our beer for distribution. And so we were able to purchase some used equipment from a brewery that was growing out in Indianapolis. We got that equipment. We talked to the owners of this building, found that this space was available, and just put that plan together. So we opened in 2012 here, and then we moved our brew pub to a different location in 2013. A bigger building became available on Mill Street. That brew pub was too small for us. We were having some growing pains, so then we moved.
It's always a great problem to have when you have to expand, because the demand is there. And you can tell why the demand is there, because you take so much pride in the product. I think that when we've talked numerous times, you take pride in the product that you're putting out. So that's evident in the product that you get and the people get to enjoy. Let's talk about, though, I want to talk mostly on this during this episode about the process and what makes Old Forge what it is, a great local brew. But Pennsylvania is one of the major hotbeds for craft brewers. A little bit of your thoughts on maybe why Pennsylvania is that?
Pennsylvania is great for brewing. I feel like that's what kind of got me into it way back when. First of all, we have Yuengling in our state, America's oldest brewery. They're pretty much right in our backyard. They make great beer. They've done it for a long time. You kind of have a connection with the brewery there. And then from that point on, a lot of other breweries, Stouts and Victory and Weyerbacher and Trogs, and all these breweries that have been open 20, 25 years, they really set the bar and allowed people like me to understand that, hey, if they can do it, maybe we can do it. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I believe when we opened, there may have been 50 breweries in the state, and right now there's over 300. So, the proof is right there.
And I think what you said, and I'm forgetting the words that you used, but like Yuengling is a great example. Schuylkill County people were Yuengling people because they took pride in being a local brewer And that's the product that they use. And you saw it all the time in Schuylkill County growing up. I think the people at Danville have also taken you as that's their home brew.
Absolutely.
And that, I know when you open my fridge, you're going to see Old Forge products there because it's a local brew. And people who love craft beers, I love to share something from my region and say, here, try this. And I think people do buy in and take ownership of that product.
We're very fortunate. The local community has embraced us with open arms, and we wouldn't be what we are without all the local support. People not just coming to our pub, but also just supporting our brand and supporting all of our efforts. Anytime we have fundraising or charity activities, everybody gets behind it. It's great.
Well, and you're part of it too, because when I saw so many fundraisers that you've done, and you've been a big part of being a part of the community. So thank you for that. Let's talk a little bit about the process, and let's talk about the commercial side of Old Forge Brewing. How many employees?
We have about 40 employees. It fluctuates a little bit depending on seasonal demands, but for the most part, 40 employees is what it takes for us to operate.
Great. And we're here at the brewery, and this is where it starts.
Yeah, this is where it starts. This is our malt room. We get our raw materials in, malted barley and different specialty grains. Sometimes we use wheat in certain products. So we store it all here. It comes in 55-pound sacks. This is the room that we actually mill all of the grains. When the brewing process starts, you have to crack the grains and get exposure to the insides. So this is the room that it happens in.
So by cracking the grains, it really starts to release different...
Yes, you have to break open the husk, and then when you get further along in the brewing process, once you start your mash in, you need to have hot water. Hot water will mix in with the grains and activate enzymes, and that will start converting the starches to sugars. And so during that process, it's a lot more complicated, but that simplifies it down.
Well, we'll talk about that when we get to that, when we get to the brewing process. But here, how do you select what grains and where are they coming from?
That changes with time and with our goals for the types of beer we want to make. We can source materials from pretty much anywhere. If we want Canadian or U.S. barley, if we want German or English, there's different malts you can buy, and depending on the styles that we want to make and what we want to do, we will source them from where we need to source them from. The majority of our stuff, we try to buy everything in the U.S. Quality is high, and with the boom in the craft brewing industry, there's a lot of suppliers out there who can supply top quality ingredients.
Well, will a German wheat or a differ in flavor profile?
Yes, yeah, you do get differences. So, for instance, our Paradise Pilsner, we use German malts and German hops in that because we're making a German-style Pilsner. So that's what we want to do. But for, let's say, our Overbite IPA, that's an American IPA, we're using all the American malts and American hops. It is just the way that the styles go. We could do whatever we wanted, and I'm sure a lot of other breweries will play around with different things, and sometimes we do too, but we try to start from a more traditional base and start there and then evolve.
Trial and error, I'm sure.
Yeah, trial and error.
A lot of trial and error.
And learn as we go, and then if we want to make changes, we'll make changes based on our perceptions and our consumer feedback on how we want to improve the beer.
One of the neat things after being in the legislature and getting to know you and learning about the brewing process and the brewing industry is that you folks aren't parochial. A lot of brewers will come together and work together.
Yeah, it's like a fraternity. It's great. And I know back in the beginning, I had a lot of questions. I didn't have a lot of experience. We just jumped right in with both feet. And I would try to solve problems as best I could, and whenever I hit a wall, I would reach out to my fellow brewers, and overwhelmingly they would give help or their experiences and try to give me some guidance. It's very difficult to just give a straight answer if it's a complex problem, but they would give me guidance on what to look for, and it's helped along the way. And now it's kind of funny. because I still consider myself to be a newbie and not knowing much. But we've been open 8 years, and now I notice some of the other brewers who have opened in the past few years
are reaching out to
me, and it's like, oh yeah, I did experience that, and you try to help them out.
That's great. That's great. I really enjoy when I see that collaboration. So we're going to go from here, and let's go now to where we process and where we start the brewing process. So from the malt room, it's ground.
Yep.
Is that?
Yep.
And then it's coming through an auger system, and it comes to here. What are you looking at here?
So it drops through, comes through the auger system and drops through into what's called our mash tun. So the mash tun is just an insulated vessel. It's not heated. It just uses the retained heat from the hot water. So you take hot water. There's actually a hydrator up on the top of the tank, and when the milled malt is dropping through, water mixes with it as it drops. And it lands in the mash tun, and there's actually a screen on the bottom of the mash tun. So as the mash sits and these starches get converted to sugars, eventually you're going to want to collect all that liquid, which is called wort. And then you have to boil that wort. It's not called beer yet until it's fermented. So to collect all that liquid, the reason it has a screened bottom is we use the grain bed and that screened bottom as its own filter. And so we will take the liquid wort, pump it back up on top, and have it go back through. And you do that process for about 20 minutes, and after a while, the liquid wort coming out the bottom is clear.
So it's sort of like a coffee process? I mean,
yeah,
it's
brewing, very similar.
Brewing through the grounds?
Very similar. And so the mashing process itself usually takes about 60 minutes total for us. And then once you start to draw off the liquid and collect it into the kettle, this is the boil kettle where we boil everything, you slowly run that off, and then you'll add hot water to the top of the grain bed because you want to, because there's still some remaining sugars that are trapped in there. There's only so much that can fit into the liquid that's soluble in the liquid. And then you'll rinse with hot water to collect all the other remaining sugars, add that to the kettle. That process takes about 90 minutes to 2 hours.
Okay. So now it's over in our kettle.
Now it's in our kettle. Depending on the beer, we usually boil 90 minutes, sometimes 60 minutes if it's a really pale beer, because if you're boiling it very vigorously, a pale beer could get some darker color and darker flavors from the boil. And this is where all the hops are added. So we add hops into the kettle. Hops are used to balance the sweetness of the malt. So the wort is actually like a sugary sweet liquid. It's like a syrup. You boil it, you add some hops, that adds some bitterness, which balances that out. The other benefit of hops is they have some bacteriostatic properties that will eliminate the growth of certain bacteria if it would happen to get in there.
What's the temperature?
We boil at 212.
Okay. And that process takes how long?
90 minutes, yeah, 60 to 90 minutes depending on the beer. And so usually you'll add hops at the beginning of the boil, which adds the most bitterness. And then if you add hops later in the boil, it won't contribute as much bitterness, but it will contribute more flavor and aroma. So if you notice hoppy beers like IPAs, they'll have hops both added at the beginning to get that bitter kick, and then hops towards the end, which give you more of that aroma and flavor that you smell.
It's timing, it's the amounts, it's a whole lot of different things that give you the profile of the beers that you have.
So every beer is different depending on what you're shooting for.
What about the spent grains then that are?
So the spent grains, we have these big totes. Each tote holds about 1,500 to 2,000 pounds. We'll just take a rake all the spent grains into the tote. We forklift it outside, and then a local farmer, Brian Torkowski, he comes, he picks up all the spent grain, and then he mixes it in with his animal feed for his cattle.
Nice, nice. From here, it goes to?
So from here, after the boil process is done, you're going to have to cool it back down to room temperature. so that you can add your yeast and fermentation can begin.
So it sits here until it gets back down to room temperature?
Not exactly. It could. But that's not the best way to do it. What you want to do is you want to make sure that that liquid, when it gets into the fermenter, is clear. You know, just like coming from your mash to your boil, you don't want solids. You don't want all those extra proteins coming in. Same thing here. All the vegetable matter from the hops, plus during the boil, protein tends to coagulate that exists in the malt, which is a good thing because it clumps together, and you don't want protein in your beer. All those extra proteins will haze up your beer, have a poor shelf life. It'll affect the flavor. So rather than filtering it out, what we do is we whirlpool it. That's what this tank is. So as soon as the boil kettle is over, or the boil is finished, it comes from the boil kettle, we pump it over on this inlet, which goes into the tank and causes it to spin as it enters the tank. Now it's still pretty hot. I would say on average it's about 190 degrees maybe. So it's still safe, it's still sanitary, nothing's gonna grow in there. And as that spins, you let it sit and settle for about 30 minutes. All of your proteins and hop particles conglomerate into the middle in a cone because of the spinning process. And then what we do is we suck the clear liquid wort off the side, and that way you don't have to filter it. You take it off the side near the bottom, and all the proteins are in the middle in a big clump. And then you can take that hot liquid off the side, it's clear now, and we pump it through a heat exchanger. We use groundwater for the first stage of our heat exchanger. Groundwater comes in at, let's just say, 70 degrees. Comes in the one side of the heat exchanger at 70. The liquid wort's coming in at, say, 180. The heat gets exchanged. The wort comes out the other side at about 70. The water comes out the other side. There's some loss, so it's at about 140, 150, and we collect it back in our water tank instead of wasting it. And then we use it again either in the next brew or we use it in cleaning. Then we have a secondary heat exchanger, which is cooled by a propylene glycol circulating refrigerant system. And then we can further fine-tune the temperature that we want. So then that wort going into that would be about 70. The propylene glycol is about 28 degrees, so that's why we will fine-tune with a valve how much cooling we want. And then we can hit whatever target temperature for the wort in the fermentation tank. So if we want that beer to ferment at 65 degrees, we'll hit it at 65 degrees. If we want it to be a lager at 55 degrees, it'll be at 55 degrees. So that's pretty much the process that takes place in the brew house, like on a full brew day.
So we're at fermentation. Now the wort is brought to whatever temperature because of the heat exchange, and now we're going into these tanks.
Yep. So these tanks is where we pitch the yeast and fermentation takes place. Each of these tanks holds multiple brews. So we can brew on our brew house 20 barrels, which is 31 gallons in a barrel. And each one of these tanks is 40 barrels here, 50 barrels there, and 100 barrels there. So depending on the beer and how much we have to make, we will just do multiple batches and fill it multiple times. So we'll pitch the yeast. We choose whatever yeast depending on the flavor profile we want. And we actually will add a little bit of oxygen because the yeast need oxygen to grow, to make themselves ready for fermentation. Fermentation, once alcohol starts being produced in larger quantities, becomes a toxic environment for yeast, so they have to be healthy enough to get through that. So what we do is you can actually hear one bubbling right now.
You can hear it now, yes.
Or two of them bubbling. That's the CO2 coming off. So when yeast consume the sugars, they produce alcohol and carbon dioxide. That's primarily what they produce. So the alcohol stays in the beer, the CO2 bubbles off into a bucket full of sanitizer. When fermentation is finished, we will condition the beer, bring the temperature down, when you do that, the yeast that are suspended all throughout the beer fermenting it all tend to drop to the bottom, which is a good thing. Once the yeast is all dropped to the bottom, we are able to either harvest it again for another batch out our bottom valve, or we could dump it and get rid of it. Some people like to take it and put it in like compost. And then we're able to take the clear beer off of our racking arm. That's called a racking arm because you can kind of see this piece sticking up. That arm is an elbow. That valve goes into the tank, and this tells you what direction that arm is pointing. And we can, without opening it, we can rotate it. So we can take clear beer off the top with all the yeast and solids on the bottom. And then as we're moving this out to the packaging tank, we can just rotate that arm down, keep getting clear beer. In that way, we don't have to filter as much. We do have a filter. We basically bypass our filter up until this arm turns.
Okay.
So in a 40-barrel tank, we can actually send about 33, 34 barrels unfiltered, but clear beer. And I think that enhances the flavor and quality of it.
Sure. The fermentation process, different times for different profiles?
Yeah, typical ale for us is about 4 to 7 days for primary fermentation. A lager would be 7 to 14 days. Primary fermentation is where pretty much mostly all of your bubbling is taking place. Mostly all of your sugars are consumed. And then we like to do a secondary fermentation after that. And the secondary fermentation is mainly for allowing the yeast to consume any of the compounds that they had given off as byproducts of metabolism. It helps clean up the flavor. Ales don't need as long of a time. Lagers need a longer time. That's actually how the word lager it means to age in German. So when you're using a lager yeast, you need to age it a little longer. And that's why lagers tend to have a much cleaner, crisper flavor profile than an ale. So it depends on the beer. So our conditioning times vary a lot. But I'd say on average, we can have a beer from brew day to packaging. For an ale for us is about 3 weeks. For a lager, it's probably 5 weeks.
So that's a great segue. From here, it's beer. It's not word anymore.
That's right.
It's beer.
It is beer.
And now we got to package it.
Yep.
So let's talk about the packaging.
Okay.
We went from our grains that was made into a wort that went through the fermentation process, became a beer. Now we have to package it. And I know Old Forge, an Old Forge, you can buy it in a half barrel, a sixtel, which is a much smaller barrel, or you can get it in cans, 12-ounce and 16-ounce cans. No bottles. Why not?
No bottles. Well, to me, when I was always drinking beer before I had a brewery, I always thought cans were cool. I love drinking beer out of a can, and for some crazy reason it stuck in my head, and I thought if I ever owned a brewery, I'm going to put my beer in a can.
And you did.
And we did. So, but there's a lot of other benefits too. You have no light can penetrate it, so you won't get a skunky flavor. Less oxygen, which means better shelf life. Cans are lighter than bottles, so you have a better environmental impact. They're more easily recyclable.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I think I think a lot of people might not know that light and air are
the enemies of beer.
Enemies of beer. So that's great. Talk about some of your different brands that you have.
So our biggest selling brand from the brewery here is Overbite IPA, which is an American IPA. We also have our T-Rail Pale Ale. That's probably second. And then we have a whole slew of seasonals. I think we make 11 different brands we put into cans. You can actually see all the cans behind us depending on the season. Right now we have our Falling Down Brown Ale. Then we'll move into the Plowshare Porter. In the winter we have Rye Stout. We also have our Celestial Blonde in the spring. We kind of move towards darker beers in the fall and winter and go towards lighter beers spring and summer.
And you're seeing that with a number of brewers, each of them coming out with different seasonal beers. And you certainly have seen the market change from just your traditional beers that everyone knew of. I think people's tastes have become more evolved, and you see a lot more people who are going towards the craft beer because of the flavor. Tell us a little bit about how your beer is different than the major beers?
Our beer is very different. The primary reason is all of our beer is made by hand. When we were walking through each step of the process, we open the sacks, we mill it. When we mash in, we stir it with a big paddle. We don't really have any automation. We don't really have any advanced techniques to help us with the beer. It's all our senses and using our hands. Once you move up to a larger scale of brewing, you can't really do it that way. You have to rely on automation. But I feel that making it by hand is true to its roots. It's authentic. We feel like it's as much science as it is art. It's like artistic expression that we put into the beer. Basically, the beers themselves that we choose to brew are full of flavor. We don't really make any bland light beers. We make beers that we like to drink, whether they're hoppy or just fuller bodied, full flavored, depending on the season. I know me personally, I'm a seasonal beer drinker. You know, in the summer, I don't want to drink a stout. I want to drink something lighter and crisp. So I think the market kind of shows that as well.
What's the future plans?
Future plans, that's a good question. I think there's a lot of exciting things on the horizon. I can't say which direction we're going to go in, but we have a lot of opportunities with some of the changes in the laws in Pennsylvania. It will allow us to potentially open other locations, if those opportunities exist. And I can't see us right now expanding much beyond Pennsylvania with distribution, but I do feel like we could have a better presence in Pennsylvania outside of our local, few counties right around Danville.
Sure, but I know it's widely available. I see it in a number of locations. So if you go into your beer distributor, certainly ask for Old Forge products because they are a great product. Damien, thank you so much for letting us into your little world here and
Thanks for coming.
telling us about the process. Until next time, thank you for joining us for Legislative Report.